From not having to fight one of the most dangerous heavyweights in the world, to forcing Dana White into making some big changes to the promotion. Here's why UFC fighters are happy that Francis Ngannou signed with the PFL. It's always strange to see an athlete quit something at the very top of their game, but that's what the Predator did. He was untouchable in the UFC and could have easily signed a new deal to become one of the highest-paid fighters in the world. And yet he chose to take the leap of faith, risking his career to join the Professional Fighters League. Whatever happens with him, though, the move is still a net positive for other fighters in the UFC. After all, they don't have to face Francis anymore. Seriously, have you seen this guy fight? He's insanely good. Before leaving the promotion, he was on a 6-fight win streak, with his latest win coming against the former interim champ, Cyril Gane. Not to mention, he was the heavyweight champion before he vacated his belt. I mean, whether you like it or not, Francis took on everything that Dana White threw at him. Oh, and he's been dominant in all of his fights. His secret, some really precise strikes that are powerful enough to knock the wind out of you. Plus, he doesn't launch a barrage like some of the other fighters either. Patience is the name of the game for Francis, as he waits for the right moment to land his blows. And boy, do they connect. The former champ lands less than 3 significant strikes per minute, which is lower than most other MMA fighters. But again, he goes straight for the head and, more often than not, ends up getting the sweetest of contacts. Not to mention he's no slouch in terms of defense either, because he's never lost a fight via submission or knockout, which just goes to show how resilient he is as a fighter. In fact, for many people, the Predator is very much on par with someone like Jon Jones, who's absolutely terrifying in the cage. And yeah, these two were supposed to fight for the longest time too, but that bout never materialized. So, with Francis gone, there's one less heavyweight monster that others have to face to get to the very top. But that's not the only reason why other fighters are happy, because Francis has shown people a way to negotiate their deals with the UFC. As a matter of fact, he's proven that Dana White isn't the be-all end-all of MMA fighting, and there are other genuine career paths for fighters away from the promotion too. For starters, the biggest issue that Francis had with the UFC was how badly they treated their fighters. I mean, the pay was already horrendous for anyone who wasn't super popular, but to add insult to injury, the promotion also didn't include any health benefits in its contracts. That's like hiring someone to bash their head against a wall and then saying you're not going to give them a helmet. It just doesn't make sense. And more often than not, fighters who had career-threatening injuries didn't get any financial support from the UFC, which obviously made it really hard for them to ever make a comeback. Oh, and you know the contract that was on the table for Francis. It would have made him the highest-paid heavyweight in the UFC, and he still chose to turn it down, all for that sweet PFL paycheck. But, as I've already said, it was never about the money for Francis. Sure, he signed a multi-million-dollar deal that's got him sorted for life. At the same time, though, he's getting so many extra benefits that UFC fighters would love to have themselves. I mean, he even gets to control the creative direction of his new promotion, which is wild considering just how strong Dana's grip is on the UFC and how most fighters don't have any say in the sort of matchup they get. Even with Francis, Dana says he's only fought 3 times in the last 3 years, so it's a terrible deal for the PFL since he doesn't fight much. But Francis says he's never turned down any fight that Dana's thrown at him, meaning that the majority of the blame for his lack of fights lies with the UFC president instead. Besides, even though White's a great businessman, he's not exactly the best boss out there. He's hot-headed and often says some very questionable things about his fighters. And how about all the times he's just straight up lied to the media? The dude's not reliable, and with Francis going to the PFL, there's a silver lining for the other fighters that they have an out too. Just look at his deal for a sec. Not only is he a part of the league's advisory board, allowing him to look for the next big fighters to hire, but he's also the chairman of PFL Africa. Plus, every single fighter in the PFL's Superfight division, including Francis, gets a 50% cut from the pay-per-view money. It's an absolute dream. Not to mention, anyone who faces the Predator in the PFL, well, they're going to earn at least $2 million too. Here's the important bit, though. None of these things were possible before Ngannou's move to the promotion. The way he's opened up the whole MMA landscape is incredibly impressive. Before his deal, no one could even think about moving to the PFL, especially since it was such a risky career move. Now that Francis is there, though, the league has a lot more eyes on it. And with those eyes also comes investment. Seriously, the PFL's pouring so much money into its new division, and that's obviously going to include some new talent recruitment too. Also, they're currently looking to raise around $280 million to buy Bellator. Like, the PFL is super ambitious, and it wouldn't be surprising to see them nabbing some more UFC talent in the near future. Which, again, can only mean good things for the UFC fighters. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to say that if they keep signing high-profile fighters like the Predator, they're going to be competing against the UFC sooner rather than later. Plus, their pull is already insane considering they've signed some of the best fighters out there, including the likes of Jake Paul. I mean, whether you like him or not, you can't deny the clout he brings to the promotion. Not to mention, fighters would be dying to take on someone like that because it could prove to be a big break for a lot of people out there. Oh, and yeah, a lot of UFC folks are already thinking about a potential move, especially those with less time remaining on their contracts. But, even more importantly, the Predator's move has made Dana White look bad, which, in all honesty, was much needed because, again, he hasn't been the greatest boss. And now he's on the defensive. Seriously, just take a look at some of the things he's said about Francis's deal. He thinks the PFL will run out of money since it doesn't generate much revenue. On top of that, he also thinks it's stupid to let fighters go and have boxing matches while they're signed to your promotion. But the thing is, a lot of these are very old-school mindsets that may not work in the modern era. I mean, with the way influencer boxing's evolved, everyone wants a piece of the pie. So the UFC fighters are probably very envious of the people who aren't bound by their contracts and pursue other ventures. Like, it's all about that freedom. And Francis's deal has probably made a lot of people realize that no, Dana White isn't rooting for them. He only cares about the UFC. And that realization, folks, is gonna lead to something very important. It could kickstart a revolution in the UFC. Just think about it for a sec. The Predator's departure has made fighters aware of their rights more than ever. Plus, when they see their friends doing these multi-million-dollar boxing fights, they won't hesitate to go up to Dana and ask for similar terms in their contracts. After all, what's the most he can do? Say no and let the deal expire? Well, they've always got the PFL as the backup plan, which will accept them with open arms. On top of that, this move has also just shed so much light on the fighters' conditions in the UFC, with every single person on social media talking about the same thing. And when journalists start asking these hard-hitting questions during press conferences, it's going to make Dana extremely uncomfortable. He won't be able to fall back to his usual "my fighters are happy" response, because they clearly aren't. I mean, he just lost his best heavyweight fighter. All these things are going to put a lot of pressure on Dana and the UFC to introduce some massive changes to the way they run things. Heck, we might even see them allow boxing matches and giving out health benefits, which is exactly what MMA and, more importantly, the UFC fighters need right now. And there you have it. From forcing Dana White into making some big changes to the promotion to not having to fight one of the most dangerous heavyweights in the world. That's why UFC fighters are happy that Francis Ngannou signed with the PFL.